do that. Okay, and then for today, we have the two moderators will be Naja Brown and Tony Allison. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to those two. So it's all yours.
Okay. Go ahead, Tony. Go ahead.
Thank you, Naja. Yeah, Tony Allison, I'm the co-chair of Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity, along with Joe. And I wanted to welcome everyone tonight. A lot of board members here. It's great. Board directors, and also some new people. And we love to see new people. And I just want to mention in passing, I particularly appreciate, I see Chandra Hampson is here. She's Seattle School Board president and represents the District 3 that Roosevelt High School is in. So thanks for coming, Chandra. We know how busy you are. And again, welcome to everybody else, and welcome to Dr. Alex Manning. And it's really good to see him here. So I'm going to be brief so we can get to the discussion, the talk and the discussion. But there was some background information about Dr. Manning that hopefully you guys saw. I'll just quickly summarize that of all his fantastic accomplishments, the greatest one was that he grew up in Seattle, and I actually got to meet him a few times. He went to Garfield High School, graduated from there, and that's okay. It's not Roosevelt, but it's still, it's still pretty good. And I've never admitted this in a rare meeting before, but both my sons went to Garfield as well, which is how I met Alex back in those days, years. Alex went on to Howard University, got his bachelor's in sociology.
By the
and I see someone's needs to mute there. Looks like Daniel Heller. And then he went on to Minnesota, University of Minnesota, got a PhD in sociology and became an expert in, I'll let him describe it more, but issues related to race and particularly sports. So then he got his first teaching job at Jacksonville University in Florida, and then now is on professor at Hamilton College in upstate New York. So amongst other things, he's been residing in different corners of the United States and had a chance to sort of see his topic from those perspectives, including, of course, Seattle growing up. So that's a summary. Again, welcome everyone. And Naja Brown, before we turn it over to Alex, is going to talk a little bit about the format for tonight. Thanks, Naja.
Mute, Naja, the mute.
Thank you. I said more than that, but thank you. Welcome, Dr. Manning. I'm one of the moderators. I'm a Roosevelt alumni, and I am pleased that you're here with us this evening to share. So the format is going to be, we've got about 80 minutes, and we're going to give you approximately a half hour to do your presentation. And I know that all that you have planned for us will spark a lot of questions and discussion. So we will present some questions to you that were presented to you prior to the session, and then anything that comes to us through the chat. So everyone who's participating, thank you for being here. If you have questions that you want us to pose to Dr. Manning during his session, during our session after his presentation, just write them in the chat and we will monitor that. And then also let me just say that Rare really would love to hear from you at the end of the session. And I have posted a link to a survey, and we would ask that each of you fill out the survey and get it back to us if you can. So with that, we have 30 minutes, Dr. Manning, for you, and then we're going to have a group discussion for about 30 minutes. And then at the end of our session, toward the very end, we're going to ask you and then open up for discussion. What are some action steps that Rare can take to support the information that you provided us so that we can become more active in eliminating racism, inequities that show up in sport for African-American people? BIPOC people, and I'm going to include AAPI too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're willing and ready to hear from you, Dr. Manning. So welcome.
Thank you, Naja. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Joe, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. It's really exciting and share my work with folks, especially my hometown. I don't think I've really had that experience yet. Real quick, for a technical thing before we start, I do have slides. I don't know if I can share them. I think Joe, so if you make me a co-host.
Yes, you'll be able to show it. You're okay.
Okay, share screen. There we go. Let's do this. Got used to doing this in Zoom teaching. All right, so open that up. Oh, there's the pin. All right, so yes, I'm excited to share with y'all some personal experience, but also what I've spent a lot of time over the last 8 to 10 years researching about sort of the relationship between racism and race in sports, mainly focused in the United States, but I have awareness of in a global sense, but mainly focused on the United States. So here's kind of where I'm going to try to take us in these 30 minutes. I'm going to give you a little personal bio and also why I spend so much time studying sports for a living and teaching about it from a sociological perspective. I'll share a little bit of just about my general kind of research areas, teaching areas, and then I'll dig more specifically into how scholars understand the relationship between sports and race. So after that kind of overview, I'll dive into my dissertation research, but really the case of youth soccer, which it is one case, but I think we could sort of think about other sports in relation to youth soccer as well. And that I'll take you through that, share some findings, and we'll have an open discussion and conversation. And so a little bit about myself. Tony mentioned, I grew up in Seattle, went to Garfield High School. Family loves sports, grew up playing lots of sports. I consider sports a key, right, one key socialization tool for myself. And so I say that, right, not just learning sense of confidence, fitness, etc., but really about learning about the social world before you might have, say, academic terms to understand the world we live in, right, before, say, formal education. So I did, right, the kind of typical youth baseball, youth soccer, I'm blanking on other sports, basketball, etc., all those kind of community-based sports. But at Garfield High School, I think, too, these sports I was able to kind of gauge a sense about one, I didn't know it at the time exactly, but ideas about, say, segregation, class and racial, ideas about gender, ideas about how that works in the city itself and how that operates through sports. So for instance, just a quick couple examples from the personal is, right, in baseball, getting into travel baseball, right, conversations with my folks about cost to participate in sports that generally, in baseball in Seattle, generally mostly white sport, especially if you go out to the regions, except for maybe parts of South Seattle, right? And decisions we had about, okay, can we actually commit to doing all that? But this also, in schools, specifically sports, is a way to really see class and race kind of move from the classroom dynamics, right, in terms of academics, but to sort of the sporting field. And so, for instance, I played high school football, which generally, Garfield was terrible. We won 2 games in my whole time playing. But the idea was that we had a kind of more class and racially diverse group of people, right? It really kind of reflected more black middle, black working class folks and white working class folks. Whereas when I played soccer, right, it was a much different sort of composition, right? It was much more sort of middle to upper middle class. And even the ways I interacted with people changed. The way coaches, the way kind of the whole energy was different. And so moving forward, that kind of always was helpful for me to understand the world. And I kind of continued to fall in love with soccer as I left high school, continue to play in different, more just recreationally and fun, but also try to understand it better. So these pictures are from Senegal and even Seattle. Soccer was a way for me to understand immigrant communities through this. I don't know if the tournament's still happening, but there was an All Nations Cup, which you have all these immigrant communities kind of form teams and participate in the summer tournament. So I got to guest play for Cameroon, but it was kind of this constant interaction and a way to understand, right, different immigrant experiences and community-based experiences in the Seattle area through a tournament like this. So with that all personal, that really quick personal bio, these are kind of the general questions I'm always asking myself and also asking my students when I teach. So right, I ask these questions: how is sport right? Or sports, a social institution, how does it operate, right? What are its structures? What's its organizational structure, its norms? What ideals does sport reproduce? Why does sport mean so much to people? Why do we care, right? Even before this conversation, we were talking about the Cowboys, right? And baseball, right? Even before we started. And this fourth question, how do communities actually experience and do sport? What does that practice look like? And then I think the bigger questions that even kind of transpose outward is, how is sport connected to power, inequality, systems of racism and other isms, sexism, homophobia, classism? And I ask my students a lot, and I think about this, is how is it sport both a site of repression and exploitation, but also a place where resistance and social transformation can occur? And then I think these last two questions we can, I think, talk about more in discussion as well, but I ask this is, do we think sports has some type of distinct cultural power?
Interrupted the dishwasher.
Oops, why do I watch the mute? And if so, why, right? People talk about sport as being an escapist place or a separate place, a microcosm of society. But does sport kind of have some semi-independent power? And then also, what do we think sports should be?
Yeah.
It looks like David, Joe, can you mute him? We need to put everyone on mute, please.
Am I?
Might be Dave Watts, I don't know.
We get it? I think we're good. We'll see. Okay, so with all those questions, I think I tried to merge these kind of three areas of scholarship. And I want to also, as I kind of explore these questions. So one is the sociology of sport. And this can be both academic, but also even like poems and artists such as Eduardo Galeano writing about soccer and Sun and Shadow from South America. But this book, C.L.R. James in the top left corner, Beyond a Boundary, is, I think, for me, like one foundational sort of text. And C.L.R. James writes wonderfully about sort of the role of cricket and how it tells us a lot about colonialism and power and race, et cetera, and nationhood and citizenship, but as a way of really understanding what the relationship between sport and society is. But I try to take that and merge it with scholarship on race, started in the tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois and critical race theory. And then this third section, which I think is kind of my, I think is an underappreciated focus, is how families and youth and culture are tied to this. So there's these great works called Unequal Childhoods, or this by Annette Leroux, which is all about sort of parenting culture in America, and also Playing to Win, about sort of the competitive childhood that defines a lot of American life today as well. So these are kind of the areas I kind of draw from. And so given that this, the topic that we're talking about, race and sports, I will want to talk briefly how I sort of orient myself towards this relationship. So Ben Carrington, the scholar on the left, and others talk about sport as a sort of contested racial terrain, which is in the tradition of Stuart Hall and C.R.L. James. Back to that question, I talked about sport being a place of both resistance and a place of reproducing power and inequality and oppression. So that's how I understand sports, this constant racialized project. There's different meanings, images, ideals, material resources being struggled over, reproduced, and sometimes transformed through sports. And I'm not going to talk specifically about the idea of the Black athlete today. I'm happy to talk about it more, but I think it's important to know, especially with what's going on in the public today, that the idea from this view, and I agree with this, the idea and construction of the Black athlete is very much linked sort of to colonialism, and it's tied to even how we think about race in modern times. So if you actually go back to the era of Jack Johnson in boxing, you see this creation of the idea of a Black athlete, right, which wasn't really in a lexicon or discourse. And then how does that transpose onto racialized politics of the time? And so, importantly, we come to today is that all Black athletes and other athletes of color are actually committing political acts just by simply participating in sports at all types of levels. And athletes, whether it's from the youth level to the professional level, are sort of inheriting this legacy and this social responsibility. So that's a big macro picture, but now I'm going to take you into a case. And this case for me is youth soccer, because soccer just captivates me for a variety of reasons. And importantly, I'll focus on these couple bullet points on the left, is that often, especially today, right, with sort of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, or we go back to the 60s and the Olympic protest movements, that we often think about sport and politics and race at the level of elite spectacle, right? We focus on the biggest athletes, right? What are they doing? What are they saying? And that is important. And I've written about this and I pay attention. We often miss what happens with who's actually doing sport, the participatory level, youth level, which has this massive presence in American society, both in terms of numbers of who participates, economic investment, how families spend their time, right? How much people, what are people learning and interacting? And I think often we don't take seriously its social power. And so to take those 2 points together, this quote on the right from Jurgen Klinsmann back in 2010, who was the coach of the US men's national team, kind of started me on this path even more, where after the US men got knocked out of the World Cup in 2010 to Ghana, because American exceptionalism is obsessed with why the men aren't good enough, why aren't we dominating the world's game, which is a silly idea. And he says soccer is very similar to basketball. You need players out of the lower class environment, and soccer worldwide is a lower class environment sport. Compared to basketball, because you look at all these guys, they're coming from the inner cities. So we need to find ways to connect with Hispanics and everyone in the US, get the kids that are really hungry. And I wanted to share this quote because I think sports are powerful because of how bluntly people will talk about race and class. Other realms of society, we kind of don't do it. It's kind of a safer space to talk in a way, right? It's seen as kind of less serious. In this case, it's like, it should be positive. We need diversity. We need inclusion to be better. Right? But here it's what is actually being inferred about sort of race and class through Klinsmann's sports. So I want to know, okay, if the top man, the top boss in US soccer is saying this, what is happening on the ground in everyday life for the mass amount of kids who are playing and the coaches who are participating? So what did I do? I spent, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years doing multi-site relational ethnographies, right? Immersing myself in different communities, different soccer playing communities at the youth level. So I spent 3.5 years observing, talking with, coaching, refereeing folks I label at a sort of alternative youth soccer organization. By that, they just they wanted to go against sort of hyper competition. They wanted to be diverse. I spent 8 months with an elite professional academy. So this is a soccer community that's really focused on producing D1 college players and even making top pro players, right, to make soccer better in the US. I spent 6 months at high school observing high school games in the Twin Cities area, which had a range of high schools, right? So high schools that might look like Roosevelt, high schools that look more like Garfield, high schools that look more like, say, Chief Sealth or schools in Tukwila. And I also interviewed about 40 folks, parents, players, and coaches about their experiences in the game and what do they think. So real quick, this work took place in the Twin Cities. And so we can think maybe in Q&A what this might compare like to the Seattle context. But right, just for a little backdrop, the racial landscape of the Twin Cities, historically, one of the whitest major metropolitan areas in the country, but more increasingly changing due to different migration patterns of Somali, Hmong, Karen, and Latino folks. And the Twin Cities area is about 25% people of color. And racial segregation shapes the city like it does for many other American cities throughout the country. And so I'm going to focus on section 3 of my dissertation. I can talk about these other ones with gender or sort of the norms of these spaces. I'm really going to focus on how race sort of flowed in and out of youth soccer in the Twin Cities. And so these are the different spaces of soccer. So I think you could do this, just a little backdrop. You can make a field, right, where you can kind of map out the different communities or different kind of levels and organizations participating in sport. You could do this with any sport, but this is the case of soccer, right? So you have organized travel soccer, think about like your select teams, competitive, but not like super serious. You have high school or interscholastic soccer, which can have really competitive elements, but can also be more participatory since the cost to play is a lot less. You can think about recreational soccer, think like community centers, like so in Seattle, like Mount Baker, McGillivray, Capitol Hill, right? Everyone kind of has their little club. It's pretty accessible to participate. You play one season, not all season. There's ethnic immigrant soccer. This happens sort of outside, right? Kind of the formal adult organized spaces. There's the elite academies. Say the Sounders now have one of these, right? Where they have like full-time professional kids, right? They're playing. They might go to school, but their full-time basically job is to play. And then there's risk prevention soccer, and this could happen. Risk prevention, like you think about like police athletic leagues in basketball or programs designed to kind of gear towards, say, refugee communities, use sport to kind of help them stay away from, quote, risk actions. Okay, so the findings I'm going to talk you through. So first is that that lots of people who I spent time with really valued the sport and soccer for being this diverse space, kind of a distinct diverse space that wasn't present in other aspects of their lives. And if you actually, through the sport, did see communities that often would not interact with one another due to segregation in schools and neighborhoods, actually come together and interact, right? So that was kind of that's the semi-independent power of sport. But at the same time, as this is existing, there are racial ruptures and fractures and contradictions, and this occurs through overt racist acts in the interpersonal level. But I think more subtly, it happens through kind of how people talk and discuss race just as they're interacting through the sport. And the third thing I'll share is how youth themselves make sense of race. I think sometimes we miss this too when we talk about the relationship with sport. We don't actually take seriously what young people are saying and doing. Okay, so to take you a little more dive in. So these are through the interviews. I would often ask people what they like about soccer. So these are 3 quotes that come out, and there are many more of these kind of talking in these type of terms. So often you hear talking happy diversity, or I call cosmopolitan talk. So Adam, a father who has a son who plays in alternative soccer and high school soccer, he would say, quote, it's one of these activities where kids can be in a lot of different kinds of situations, fanship, the countries, it's kind of a global game. It's what everyone says. Transcends ethnicity, nationality, language, geography. There's so many different pieces to it that are transcendent. I talked to a player who played at a high school that was in the center of the city, pretty diverse in terms of class and race and immigrant background. So Hope was a Black male, first generation immigrant. He said his team, reflecting on his high school team, said perfect, just so diverse, like people from Haiti, Somalia, Ethiopia, Egypt. Then when I was talking to someone like Darren, a Black African-American dad who had daughters playing in organized travel soccer, this club that was particularly mostly middle to upper middle class, parents in that class, talked about his team being different than the other type of organized travel teams. He said, I love seeing how we have diversity. When we play these other teams, they might have like one Black face. Our team has a Native American girl, Chinese American girl. My daughter is biracial. My daughter is Japanese. And so he says, it's so cool to see us play these other teams where their only diversity is whether the blonde hair is curly or straight. I had multiple people even mention that kind of framework, like their diversity is just in their hair. So that's kind of interesting. So to be fair to the people I spent lots of time with the interview, like this is based off real experiences, right? So I would argue that they often are interacting what Elijah Anderson calls cosmopolitan canopies. And we might be able to think about what are the canopies that exist in Seattle, right? Where basically seemingly racial and ethnic borders are de-emphasized and opportunities are created for people to sort of interact with each other in a sort of relaxed context. So Anderson talks about this in relationship to like Philadelphia and like markets and like shopping and food. But we can think about this also with relation to sport. These canopies or schools can vary in scale, image, and social definition. And I'd argue that the ideal vision of sport and soccer, which often these parents and players are referring to, is like a diverse cosmopolitan canopy. So that's present, right? That's kind of I would say like the idealized vision of what a soccer and sport can be. And so I did observe these, right? As I spent lots of time bouncing around the cities. So for instance, there'd be these futsal communities where you'd have neighborhood Latino teams from the immigrant soccer space come together and play against organized travel teams with mostly white suburban kids. You have teams that were just diverse within themselves. And that would take place in a neighborhood, right, that was majority working class and people of color, right? So you kind of would have white privileged folks come into a space they really often wouldn't come into because of this sort of city indoor futsal. And this was not just a one-off. I could reference the Parks and Rec League in St. Paul, where you basically had every neighborhood team come to one location. So you would kind of see the different neighborhoods gather for 4 nights a week to watch their kids play from like the U7, 12-year-old range. So these places, right? And people are drawing on this to kind of say, this is why we like this sport. This is why I think it's important for my kids to participate in, right? It teaches them things I want them to be socialized in. But unfortunately, right, these canopies are vulnerable, right? It's not just all happy. And so when I would talk especially parents and kids of color, I would ask them about their experiences with racism and race. And I asked this to everyone, white folks included. And so Leslie, a Black mother, described to me sort of the racist aggressions and microaggressions they would either deal with as parents or they would see their kids deal with. And so this first quote is from Leslie, who has a Black son who plays in alternative soccer, but also kind of bounces between different spaces. And he and his Latino friend joined a more organized travel team, I think in the first-ring suburbs of the Twin Cities, and said, "Oh yeah, his one friend Diego, he's Mexican. You know, with Donald Trump. One of the Northview girls told him, I hope Donald Trump wins so they can deport you. That kind of crazy stuff. You know, they have to deal with that." So I want to emphasize, I could have picked multiple quotes. This Leslie is not an anomaly. I had players tell me about how a Latino player tell me about how referees would tell them that they couldn't speak Spanish on the field. You had lots of people talk about ref mistreatment. So these are kind of common instances being shared, right? And so how the sport can sort of amplify differences and power differences between groups and sort of offer these moments of racist treatment. So I'm going to highlight this again through there's this huge, it's actually like this regional and even national, actually international, they get teams from everywhere. In Minneapolis, it's called the Midwest World Cup. So you have all these teams from over 40 states and multiple countries coming. It's like a huge youth soccer celebration. It's like kids are very excited to participate in it. And so I was coaching a team under the alternative soccer banner, and they were playing an all Latino team from Texas. And so the team I was coaching is mostly middle class, but diverse in Black, white, and Latino, and a couple Asian folks. And so this is from one of my field notes. I'm standing on the sidelines and watching Kick-It's 16 to 17-year-old boys team play an all Latino team from Texas. I'm baking in the sun, and the game proceeds without major incident. It's barely physical, but it's seemingly typical with adolescents' competitiveness. Later, I learned that my impression wasn't right. About 20 minutes after the game, the referees leave the field and most of the players meander in different directions. Marcus, a Black American on the team, walks towards me and tells me, Alex, Nate, his teammate, who's also Black, was called the N-word by one of their players. I'm slightly taken aback and ask if Nate was okay and if they told me one. Marcus tells me that he told the coach and that coach talked to the referee, but that's it. So I want to emphasize about this is that I have a couple of different examples of this in my time on the field, but what I think is important is that Marcus shares the details of this incident with me in a very matter-of-fact fashion. There's no uproar, display of strong emotions. There's no meeting amongst the teams, conversations with coaches. There's no complaint filed to tournament officials. Instead, everyone kind of goes about their business for the rest of the tournament. The racial slur is used and it ruptures what I would consider the celebratory global multicultural youth tournament for two Black players. But at the same time, this rupture is sort of contained and there's no lasting impact, right, on the collective. Everything just keeps going along. And so those type of incidents, while not all happening all the time, they're not infrequent, right? And they show kind of how thin this sort of happy diversity, cosmopolitan ideal is sort of in the reality of everyday life. So the next example I want to give is more in the level of discourse, not in overt racist sort of aggression, like interpersonal slur. And so it happens kind of in subtle ways. So this is while I'm spending time in this community center where this alternative youth soccer is happening, and I'm talking to a coach and a dad, and I'll kind of read you another field note from this interaction. So James, a Latino dad with two sons who play at the club, which I call Kick It, walks into the coach's office. After saying hi, he asks if Coach Kelly, who's a white man, saw his email about the U16 Men's World Cup team. James is particularly struck by his own observations that if you're a Black player, you're likely to play striker or defense, but not in the midfield. For Latino players, it is the opposite. But James remains fixated on the positional patterns of Black players. He asks why that is, and before me, I can explain the concept of positional attacking. Coach Kelly jumps in awkwardly and draws upon his experience as coaching. He explains that white coaches often view Black players as naturally physically strong, fast, undisciplined, and that such assumptions are perceived to be a good fit for positions that require, quote, less team responsibility. So after he kind of offers his explanation, James is still interested in discussing why Black players play forward and not in the midfield. So I chime in and try to quickly explain that black players are frequently pushed to those positions, not encouraged to play other roles, and that there's no evidence of different racial groups having any different innate physical ability compared to others. James persists and says, but there are a lot of cases where black players are faster and stronger. And the coach Kelly relents on his earlier, more sociological explanation and said, yeah, black players, they're physical. James then ruminates about how such attributes of black physicality aren't a match for the midfield. And the coach Kelly then adds, it's the hardest position. The midfield is often in soccer circles the most mentally, physically demanding position of sport. And Kelly's soft affirmation of James's word implies that black players are not fit for the position because of the need for game intelligence, vision, spatial awareness, discipline, etc. As the conversation continues, I try to keep emphasizing that the black players you see at the top doesn't represent the wide range of athletic ability and styles of play. But then James buckles down and offers a different sporting example to support his point. There aren't any white shooting guards or white Michael Jordans. So James again associates an elite sport with the natural characteristics of the black body. A few moments later, James' 6-year-old son comes into the room and asks his dad to play with him outside, which for me mercifully ends the conversation. And so again, in these brief moments, it's hard to kind of discuss the concept of racial stacking or cover how sports have historically been relatively more open for certain black people compared to other social institutions. But in this case, biological talk about race, right, a colonial logic, persists through the viewpoints of a white coach and a Latino parent, despite the fact that they often interact in racially and ethnically diverse soccer environments. They coach and see many black players within this club and the metro area at large who do not fit their stereotypes about black people, about black soccer players and black athletes as a whole. But existing in diverse spaces does not block, disrupt or overcome these kind of deeply biological notions of race. And I want to emphasize how comfortable and easy this of racial talk is for participants, right? It happens in everyday settings, casual racial myths are reproduced, right? And so it just happens again, kind of in this space with no real uproar. Now, quickly, I just want to say this quote just to kind of emphasize it's not just one incident. Jeff, who's a coach in an elite academy, right, who was really intent on developing professionals and top players, I asked him to describe his favorite team or his idealized team. And we were talking about race, and he said, I would like to have an African striker, right, big, physical, fast, strong, a Latino midfielder, stereotypes of like technical, shifty, crafty, and an American or European defender, which is coded here as kind of white, right, being sort of intelligent, smart, a leader, right, from the back, can see everything, vision. So I just want to say it's multiple kind of instances where you see this discourse happen. All right, so now I'm going to shift a bit to how young people interact and talk about race. And so they can be similar to how adults talk, but often there are variations that kind of might not make as much sense as as scholars would think, or you might think. And so here's one quick note. I was coaching a U13 team in a match against an organized travel league. And this game was full of race talk on the sidelines. So especially amongst young boys, at least in my experience, while doing these observations, we kind of constantly talk about race, right, in kind of jokey or sort of seemingly trivial ways. And so before the game, Malachi, an African-American kid who trains with the team, with a few of his teammates about the other team. They were judging their apparent skill, and made a racial association. He said to Luke, who is white, Omar Ethiopian, and Kofi, another Ethiopian American, Malachi said, that Asian kid is going to be good, while pointing at him. And so I just want to think this is benign, right? It seems benign. It's just kind of like, it's whatever. The 13-year-old kid said this to his friends. But I emphasize this is important because Asian people, especially boys and men, are often not perceived as dominant, right, in popular Western sport, right? Asian Americans document historical roots in ways Asian bodies have been deemed weaker and less masculine and made invisible within sports despite their long history of participation. Right? But in the case of soccer in the Twin Cities, where there is actually like a larger Karen and Hmong population active in this space, they get the reputation for individual skill and quickness, right? That you might not imagine that's happening in conversations about sport and race. So in this little moment, race as a fixed concept, right, with fixed stereotypes, as biological, is actually kind of reinforced and learned, but it doesn't match maybe our dominant ideas about how we might view Asians in relation to sport. So again, kids can play with biological ideas of race, which are flawed and incorrect, but they can mess it around in different ways. All right. The last note I want to share with you is an interaction about how young people interact with me But again, kind of how sports is this way for people to interact, but certain dialogues and conversations emerge. So I was spending time in this community center, and I'm working with and I'm in the rec room, and I'm working when Patrick, who's a white 14-year-old boy, comes up to me. He's like one of the more skilled kids at the center, very nice kid. He comes and sits next to me, and he says, ask me if I like Star Wars. This is in between while they're playing. I said, yeah, it's cool, but I'm not a huge fan. He then says to me, I was the first that Alex me, that you're the first Black person who said he likes Star Wars. This caught me off guard, but reminded me of conversations I had with kids in middle school and high school about what things Black kids like or are not supposed to like. I then wanted to tell him that plenty of Black people like sci-fi. He then explained to me that he was asking Black people at the soccer within the club if they like Star Wars. I thought this was the end of this odd exchange, but Patrick then asked me straight up, why are Black people ghetto? I was startled at the question, had a somewhat emotional response back. I said, that's not true. How do you know that? He then referenced his school and explained to me that his school, all the Black kids are ghetto because they're loud and wear their pants low. It's dumb. Even the Black kids who are well educated act ghetto. He made this distinction too between Black Americans and kids who had recently immigrated from Somalia and Ethiopia. So I tried to push him with a variety of points to get him to kind of reflect and think, reflect about what he said. And in hindsight, I wish I even centered his own behavior and why no one labels him in the ways, because he wears similar clothes, acts a fool plenty of times. And he knew that I disagree with him strongly, but at that moment, he bought into the idea that Black Americans are different ghetto dumps. So it's this cultural pathological argument, which is very flawed and racist. But the conversation was cut off when his father came in and he said, Patrick, we got to go. He ran out of the room and said bye. And I told him we'd talk about it some more. I was super frustrated. Again, that was kind of the end of the interaction. And so similar to what I talked about on the field, right, in terms of when racist ruptures happen, when overt slurs happen, this 2-minute interaction was an everyday incident, right? Racial discourse permeates and breaks through sort of a space. In this center, right, parents talked about this club as being so important because it was diverse, because it wasn't like the other spaces, right? Because you had kids from different walks of life. But again, so we see kind of this racial discourse break through. And again, it shows how sort of whiteness can be taken for granted in sort of diverse spaces of sports and just in general. And again, Patrick is a kid who has plenty of friends who are kids of color. He has his best friends, Ethiopian, Costa Rican, Black American, Mexican American, Cameroonian American. So when you watch him play, you might think, essentialize or internalize such logics about racial hierarchies or anti-Blackness. And I want to be clear, Patrick is not static or fixed in this moment I'm sharing with you. He's now an adult, a young adult, and he's grown. But it's important to see how he's interacting within sports in relation to, say, his school, which he's reflecting clearly on sort of stereotypes and segregation and that's happening, what he's getting from school, media, families, peers. And he's constantly making sense of race. So I kind of signaled this, right? So everyday interactions in youth soccer, and I think we can talk about this in sports, are often, with regard to race, are often fleeting, superficial. I'd also add very crucial and important, but often unsatisfying, especially if you're on the kind of receiving end, if you operate if you are a marginalized person. People are making sense of race in very messy ways. It might not always make the most sense, but they're constantly navigating how race is informing, and racism is informing the sport they're participating in. And I would add that often when we talk about sports and race, especially at the youth level, there's very much people are romanticizing sort of the diversity element, right? Everyone can kind of gather together, which has some truth in it, but often it can fail to get to the heart of racial realities, racism, inequalities, both within a sport and beyond. And so these are kind of some of the bigger takeaways and implications I want us to think with, right? How can sports work in a way that basically can celebrate difference, celebrate diversity, but persistently kind of contain these really problematic racist ideas, kind of quiet the trauma induced by racist interactions through how much we kind of care about sport. And so I kind of emphasize, and also like when sports are in a kind of sense of competition. So for instance, think like, do kind of overt aggressive racist slurs emerge when sport is at a kind of hyper competitive level versus in a more cooperative, fun level. And lastly, I want to emphasize that kids and adults constantly learning and re-articulating ideas about race through their participation in sports, especially when they're not in the level of spectacle, right? Not the level of the NBA per se. And so, in other words, soccer is a microcosm of kind of our society. It's a key place, but if we just celebrate kind of its idealized potential, I would argue that's kind of very dangerous and it's easy to break down and be ruptured. All right, and not have it kind of lose its transformational potential. So I'll leave it at that. And so these are kind of questions for us to think about, like how are people experiencing youth sport in your lives or in the Seattle area? Do you think our ideals of sports culture match our social reality? And again, what do we want youth sports to be? Do we want it to be anti-racist, socially positive, equitable? What does that even look like? We can think about coaching, funding, etc. All right, thank you. I hope I didn't talk too long, but that's it. I'm excited to share and talk with y'all and answer questions. Thanks
No,
for
that was perfect, Dr. Manning. Thank you very much. Boy, you unpacked a huge topic, a large subject matter, and I'm sure that it's
You recognize any of these people?
people are thinking and contemplating what you said. We've got a couple of questions that have come up in the chat that we'll go ahead and present to you.
Okay. I'm scrolling through the chat.
So I can read it for you. This is from Jude Fisher. Jude, thank you for submitting this. Why do you suppose professional soccer fans feel so comfortable yelling racist comments?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we kind of in Europe specifically, and actually like the global soccer community, we can tie that to one, the history of like not just hooliganism, but actually there's theories about like sports as the place where men especially get to release emotions. Like it's the appropriate place to release and behave. So Elias talks about this as the uncivilized. We can use a different word, but the idea is, right, sports are a place where people get to act a fool and it's okay, right? And so soccer is for sure once people get to release, right, some type of emotional frustration, whether, work, etc., xenophobia, whatever it is, right? And so I think soccer, so globally, that offers fans kind of, that's the space where you can yell, sing loud, like you treat the player as sort of an object, right, to kind of articulate frustration. So I think that's the answer for soccer. And I think we see this even in America, like post-COVID, especially. You saw fans sort of act really bad in a lot of settings. There's more reports about, right, dumping popcorn, yelling things, like offensive things, and you see some players pushing back, right? But I think it's kind of tied to what is sport? Sport is the catharsis. And then what is the catharsis act? What actually gets said? What are people releasing?
Okay. And Jude submitted another question. Why do you think Black athletes are committing a political act for playing their sport?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think if we can unpack that more. Because when I said at the beginning, right, it might just seem like, someone's just participating in sports. They might not have an intentionality, like I am making some political stance. But why I make that point is to think historically, right? So sport is created as a sexist institution, exclusionary. It was exclusionary towards people, right, Black folks. So, right, all Black folks participating are saying, no, this institution, right, should include me, right? It should not treat me poorly. But also, what I mentioned about how the Black athlete is constructed in our minds, right? What we actually think Blackness is. What I was talking about, like physicality, the super body, right? That was basically as Black folks started to enter sport, that idea, which we can trace even more to like separation of mind and body back to slavery, right? That is being transposed onto the sport field today. So even if a Black athlete is not saying I am being political, I would argue that they're participating in this institution, right? And with where these logics kind of circulate is a political act, right? It's sort of creating these collisions, creating these thoughts. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. All right. Well, any other questions? Tony, do you have any questions that you want to pose to Dr. Manning?
I see a couple more in the chat now, maybe just came in from Mark Boyd. Thanks, Mark. Alex, is there any research on having sports teams do some anti-racist training as part of their team training? And this almost goes to the next section about, actions we might be wanting to think about as rare and others to going forward. But what do you think about that question?
Yeah, so I think this is very much, we're in a wait and see. So I can give a couple examples So at the professional level, like the Lakers actually hired a sociologist, Karita Brown, who does a lot of work on race in America. To like, I'm not exactly sure what they're doing, but she's a part of the organization, right? I assume it's along these lines. I think you see more teams, whether it's the WNBA or even, especially I would emphasize the WNBA, who are kind of taking a more anti-racist kind of framework to how they're operating. Even and this is more how they're speaking. I'm not sure about how they're training like staff, etc. That's at the professional level. At the youth level, the research is very mixed. You might have like individual coaches or like an individual organization trying to try something, right? But I would say it's very kind of small. It's not well funded. So I think we're gonna wait and see. And I think this leans what Tony was getting at. I actually think about this a lot. Like, what would this look like, right? Who are the teams doing this, right? Especially at the youth level? Who are the coaches, right? Are coaches educated in this way, or is it tied to schooling, right? So I'll keep an eye out on the research. I don't think there's a lot. I think most of it is kind of on like inclusion, right? Like, like people have done work on like, we're just going to get groups together, right? But not necessarily to sort of cultivate an anti-racist practice or consciousness. That's a good question.
Naji, do you want to read the next one or should I?
Okay, yes. And so this is one of the questions that was sent to you in advance, Dr. Manning. Could you provide one or two examples of racism that you encountered in sports as a young person growing up here in Seattle? And how was it dealt with or not? And then the second part of that question is, what are some ways to prevent or deal with racism in youth sports?
Yeah, I think this ties to Chandra wrote that in the chat too. Similar question, so that's great. I would consider myself fortunate in that I never so I mentioned some of these like overt instances in my presentation talk. I never experienced that directly, but I did experience kind of the consequences of what I was sharing with coaches talking about Blackness and how I was put in certain positions on the field, especially with soccer. Football, less so, but like I was definitely stacked. So by stacked, I mean, historically in the NFL now it's changed. Like there were no black quarterbacks. Black people would only play certain positions, right? Corner, defense, running back, etc., receiver. In soccer, it's kind of what I mentioned, right? Black people generally would either play somewhere were expected to run fast, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was put in those positions, and I actually liked other parts of the game. And it's funny, I'm not that fast, right? Like I think, but like it's for sure was interpreted and like impacted what I was doing on the field. I didn't really come to that conclusion till later, right? And upon reflection, when I was talking to other people, my best friend at the also had this experience. Like we talked about this as we kind of aged. So that's one way I would say. The other part is less about experiencing racism, but learning about race and racism. So for Garfield High School, I remember vividly to this day, we are playing, I don't know which East Side school team you could name, Skyline, East Lake. Is it East Lake? I don't know. Pick Woodinville. I don't know. One of the East Side schools. We're getting ready to play. It's like the Thursday, and Coach Roberts, wonderful man, has us standing on the track. It's like raining, Seattle rain, and he's saying, "Hey, when we go to play there, be prepared for guys to say nasty stuff." He used this, like he would say the slurs, like this is what's going to happen. Be prepared, right? And he's drawing on all his experiences, like his long time in Garfield High School as they've played in football, right, throughout the city. And like he is giving that message to 50, how many young boys, young men. And I remember that to this day, right? And we were like, nothing happened at that game, but like that is what was being that was prepared. He was preparing me for the realities of potential racism in sport in the Seattle area. So again, it didn't necessarily happen, but I was very alert and I was constantly thinking about that was in that micro case. And then later I learned, why is Garfield so bad at football? Oh, class racism, unequal resources, right, etc. So yes, that's my short answer on that. But I think as an adult now, I think doing this research has really kind of opened my eyes more to how this happens, right? Because it was not directly personal, but I was there trying to help kids, right, process this stuff.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question from Chandra. What role do you believe school booster clubs and ASB power and finding structures as exacerbate so many aspects of racism in sports, tokenism, and what are some of the best ways, in addition to policies to the contrary, which is critical, what are the best ways school communities can begin to unravel and unweave these relationships?
Yeah. So I think this is a great question and crucial. And so I think this question like funding structures and boosters. So I think they play a huge role, right? So youth sports has become more privatized, right? More like parents investing, private clubs investing to kind of secure status, right? Secure training, right? It's a professionalization game. It's a credentialing game in youth sports. That's matches kind of what's happening in academics, right? And so I think they play a huge role in reproducing these problems and inequities, right? Even I think, just a quick example, I think about an elite club. I saw them tokenize and try to recruit like 2 Somali kids for like their mostly white, expensive team. Like in the way the dads were kind of talking about how that kid will help them, right? So this is all there happening. And I would say to kind of unravel is that I think we have to work to make youth sport more participatory. I think scholastic sport, I think schools are crucial. And schools and community centers, the participatory level is where I think you can unweave some of this. Because I think the privatization part makes these inequalities worse, right? And we kind of lose the purpose of what I think a lot of us would think sport is, right? Gathering, interaction, right? Learning, positive development. And so I think about like community sports funding. So that's generally on the decline. I think about how school sports often, not in all cases, but depending on the school, like you have to be really trained up to play. Like if you actually want to participate, you have to have like a lot of resources to make the varsity team, depending on the school and depending on the sport, right? So I would actually emphasize like more intramural based sport, right? Like, or like trying to coordinate between schools. Like, hey, we're not trying to do this competitive Kinko thing, right? But we actually believe we're going to do something different, right? But use the school as a base, maybe subsidize some cost, et cetera. Because I think it's really hard in the private model because it costs you $3,000 or whatever to get in. And that's going to eliminate, if you got someone investing $3,000, you're probably not going to have like anti-racist education kind of linked in there, right? That's not necessarily what people are investing their money in. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that's a couple ideas. I'm happy to talk more about that too.
That's a good answer. As you were talking about the soccer examples, my grandson, my oldest grandson, plays with what I would call an elitist soccer club, Lake Ridge. And they pay for membership, everything costs. And I was talking to my oldest son and I said, how on earth, why does it cost so much for these kids to be in this sport and on this team? And the average child would not be able to afford it. So it seemed a little exclusionary to me, just the fees, all the fees they pay. And they had 2 and 3 different uniforms, and on certain games, they wore the green uniform, and on other days, they wore the blue uniform. And I'm saying, good grief, what happened to a t-shirt and a pair of shorts and some Converse, some Chucks? What happened? So what are your thoughts about how these elitist clubs can actually exclude others who can't afford to participate?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're spot on. I think it's been happening for a while. We had like a couple decades of this now, really, across different sports. It's not just a soccer phenomenon. And I would say this is part through how, even bigger pictures, kind of think I see someone talking about like coaching too. I think it's linked to like how what do we think of sports coaches? Think about like how do you make a career as a youth sports coach? If you want to make a living, you have to go, you generally, unless you like get a job in a school and like kind of have an educational salary, you're generally going into like these kind of spaces. Those $3,000 fees pay their salaries, right? It's not like, so I would say like we don't think of coaching as a public good in America. So to me, like that is like a big kind of logical step. Like, how do you think of coaches as actually having a huge social responsibility, but not just to say it? Like people kind of talk about, oh, coaches are important, right? But like, how do you actually make better coaches, right? I think that's linked though to elite clubs, right? So like, are coaches coaching to be in these elite clubs? Or are they coaching to be members that serve the community, to make healthy environments of play for kids in the neighborhood? So like, I think there's a lot, like the community center, right? There's in the community center. You hope a parent comes and that they do a good job for a couple of years, but if the kids want to keep playing, they have to get into that system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Naja, I see we've got a question from someone who attends a lot of these sessions, which we appreciate, Maggie Lewis. Roosevelt High School grad, and her question was, in your conversation with Patrick that you described, Alex, when you were
Mhm.
recounting it, if it had not been stopped short by him having to leave, his dad came and got him, I think. How could the conversation, what do you see, where could it have gone that would have been transformational?
That's a good question. Because it's also hard. This is why it's personal, right? Like not everyone's like ready to be like, I'm going to offer the best transformational conversation like that, right? You're not like prepared. I'm not walking through my day ready to just do this, right? But I think on reflection, I think I try to signal this, but one would have some space, one to return to it. Like I don't think we ever really came back to returning to what happened, right? That was like the fleeting part. Let's not make it fleeting. Honestly, like a teenager, my best bet to me for like laying a seed would have been like really actually having them reflect about what like his own behavior and how he doesn't do anything different actually than those kids he's talking bad about, right? Like that's like the way it's not like it's planting a seed that way. The other angle would be, again, this wasn't in the culture of the club, right? Would be just for actually later on, right? That we actually constantly be engaging in these topics, even if it wasn't about that particular instance, right? Maybe it's a year later, 3 months later, something happened. This is in Minnesota. This is before we had police killings, right? This is before George Floyd. We had Jamar Clark. We had some major incidents, right? And this space could have been. I talked with parents about this, so it's actually I talked with parents. We had some pretty intense conversations, but the kids were not involved. Like that, you have kids and innocence, right? So I actually think for transformation, it'd be no. This kind of has to be it has to be an environment where this is weaved in and it's not like taboo. But that's a really good question. It's hard. I also would just say you can't be. It's like a process. Could there be a process of that? Not like in that moment, could I have said the perfect thing to be like, oh, I think that's really hard to do.
So there's another comment here and a question from Bruce Johnson. Thank you for submitting it. It's sad to see the decline of the number of Black kids playing baseball. Do you think things have bottomed out and that that Black turnout will improve?
Yeah, I've thought about this. I mean, I grew up playing baseball. I've noticed this. You talk about like Black baseball fan. We started playing Black baseball fans, but there's like a downturn in that a little bit. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think it's some because of it's definitely travel ball, like who gets to play, right? I think it can improve if people who organize baseball kind of want it to, right? But also I want to emphasize this is also tied to bigger patterns. So there's at that angle, like, can you make baseball affordable in schools or in community centers? Can you make it accessible? The other part I think is that, sorry, a lot of talking. Sometimes your brain freezes for give me a second, it'll come back. Oh, is that this is tied to the baseball decline is also tied to how baseball is played, right? Baseball was a city game, right? It was a city game, not just a rural suburban game. And I think even like how Black people, we're talking about Black folks, like where are Black people living, right? where have they migrated to?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What are cities looking at like? I mean, I think baseball is even just less active in a city like Seattle, right? You don't see baseball being played all the time on the board. So that's like a bigger sport question, not just for Black folks. But then the other part is baseball, which is fine, but baseball is globalized. Like it's just existing in different countries, right? Where you see like Black Latinos playing in record numbers, right? So we're talking about the Black American kids, a particular case. I definitely think it's travel ball. I definitely think it's Major League Baseball never really, and like in top levels really caring about that. They don't think it's important, I would say. They'd have to take it as a serious thing for it to change.
I see that John Tabb, one of our board directors, has a hand up. John?
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very impressive and informative. I had a question. My two daughters, as far as high school, they attended a high school. I won't say the name necessarily, but it didn't really matter. It was on the east side in Bellevue. And the population percentage there, attendance-wise, was heavily Asian, like close to 70% maybe currently. And so the stereotype was always that, well, this school won't succeed in football and basketball because they don't have the right. Apparently, they're saying genetics, right? Physical size, shape, but they'll do great in golf, tennis, and gymnastics and academics. I mean, so that's it's always bothered me because it points to a question of where sometimes physical characteristics of certain races do influence talents in certain endeavors, and sometimes, they're sometimes not. So it's hard to know where to make the demarcation between when it's really like maybe a racist view, or maybe it's a reality view of actual abilities based on physical characteristics.
Yeah. So John, it's great. Thank you for that. So I think we were talking about how like Asians were referred to, right? So even to me, like race, I think about like just how it's being taught. So to me, it's like race is what in this case is like this biological notion of physical characteristics tied to race, which we know is not actually true, right? We know this is like faux science at their origin, like you said, not their genetic differences. Now, if we want to think about what people are socialized to, what sports are in like certain environments, and over time, right, we know like, and what sports are pushed, that's a different question, right? So with a certain high school, you have kids being pushed into certain things. Of course, they're going to be better at tennis, right? That we see this across the board. I think what's concerning to me too is that what's the danger of sports is that sports is a really shortcut for these kind of lazy descriptions, right? And like that's what worries me, right? The fact that folks go to the shorthand of, well, we have a lot of Asians at our school, so we're just not going to be good at basketball, which doesn't make any sense when you think about it for 5 seconds. Like we can literally go to Asia and look at all these professional players. We can actually find people that do this. It actually breaks down quick because we want to jump to the genetic because that is seemingly that's the answer that makes sense, right? And so that's the
Correct.
scary part. And that, so when you, and that maps on when you add segregation, when you add, right, these kind of histories and like without interacting with folks and stuff. So I hear you, and I think we see it a lot. And I think, you see it in it's every sport. Every sport's got a particular racialized and class culture, which then I think people go to a shorthand to be like, oh, we're just fixed and always supposed to do that. So I thought that's helpful. That's how I kind of interpret what you're sharing there.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
I see we've got one question from Chandra that's written out. Molly Edson wanted to ask one orally. So Molly, if you want to go ahead with that, and then I'll read Chandra's question after that.
Great, thank you. My question is about women in sports. Many of us on this screen graduated from Roosevelt High School in 1971. Prior to Title IX, we had no varsity sport. Well, we actually had badminton and track. So we, didn't have sport. And when you think about this group, the way it was formed was by a bunch of guys who remembered playing sports with other guys and started chatting with one another. We as women didn't have that ability to really interact racially like the guys did with sports. And also it went beyond just the years too. You would span like 3 years, you'd play a sport with a certain team. And so we really missed out, women really missed out on that. And Title IX, thank goodness, has done a lot. But I guess bringing it back to race, the Olympics seem to have brought out some real interesting aspects of women, Black women in sports. And I'm wondering if you might talk about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And the intersection or collisions between gender and race are incredibly important. They're always a part of sports. And I think I'll answer in 2 ways. So the second part, I think for sure you see Black women being leaders and taking kind of center stage in kind of our current moment of sort of, I would say, kind of liberatory or racial justice kind of politics at these like very visible levels, like you said, Olympics or other top sports. But I think it's also interesting this is not to say that this was a positive. This is just kind of a messed up consequence. I would say the sexism of sport, right? You're talking about Title IX, right? And that there was a huge struggle, right? It's still today, right? It's women struggling to get their due, their resources, opportunities, right? I would actually say that struggle, in a way, has led to this kind of current moment where you see women even more vocal, more defiant, right? More kind of independently strong about issues of equality, representation, etc. And you can even hear it in how the women who are kind of operating these limelight talk about it. They're constantly referencing history. They're constantly referencing, right, the exclusion of women in sport. So I think that's kind of a part of where we see that today, how you're seeing women lead. And because in a way, I'd also say the level of backlash on women's sports is harsh, but it's not, I would say it's not as magnified, right? Because of sexism, because it's not as commercially and visibly present, right? So there's almost like a little more space for women to kind of like emerge and articulate these ideas today, post Title IX, than I think sometimes with men with kind of the corporate world kind of constantly hovering over. But no, I think it's important. I think they're leading. I think they've been ahead of the game on this a while at all levels. Now, the second part I want to answer is at the youth level, though, I think it's a lot more common. So yes, girls have way more opportunities now, but when you do the intersection of race and gender, at immigrant status, at class, I think a lot of spaces you see the boys teams will be more racially diverse, right? Even today, you'll actually see this. I saw this a lot. Go to a high school that had tons of people of color, but you'd see the girls team of soccer and it would not look like that, right? So like, I think that's the kind of next kind of level too, is actually at the youth levels to kind of change those participatory dynamics as well. So thank you.
Thanks for that. And here's Chandra Hampson's question. And again, this sort of leads toward the next section. And maybe I'd like to, if you're okay with this, Nadja, sort of slide into that direction, which is, let's try to pin down a few ideas about what we could do. We meaning RARE, and I think Dr. Manning knows basically what RARE is. You know, our brief history of a year and what we've tried to accomplish. And we've got our sights on accomplishing a lot more. And this is one of the areas. So this question from Chandra is, I've been trying to get a sense of what level of funding increase would be necessary to actually fund coaching and other supports, and to be able to make school-based sports truly equitable and a consistent link to academic excellence. And my initial conclusion is that it would need to at least be doubled, unless you're playing football in Texas, as far as I can tell anyway. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and so it's a great question. I would love to like talk more about like numbers like involved. Like I'm not like an expert in like the budget numbers and stuff like that, but I think about, I'll give one example. So I have a good friend, a coach, she's a woman, and she wants to coach along a frame of collective social justice-based coaching, right, through sport. She is having an incredibly hard time getting hired anywhere, right? So I would say that in terms of like the number of funding, like the school-based sports, if there are positions, right? So like, I think like there's a PE teacher, right? Could each school have a person that has like a holistic training, right? I don't know what the funding number would be, right? But would be kind of create these type of sporting environments. So like, again, if you do that way, which is more, again, back to like the kind of point about going less away from like hardcore competition, which I think some of the high school sports get into, right? Versus a more like participatory ethos. And could coaches be kind of be funded? Could there be funding for coaches kind of driving that type of idea and tied to academic excellence? But the other part is like, I don't know how many sports there are in each high school, but if you're like trying to fund each sport like across the board, like Seattle schools did X amount of sports, right? And they kind of had to get a funding level for that. I think that'd be a number question. I'm not sure, but I think it's like about what's the number to actually fund coaches who are approaching the job with that kind of mindset, not just a mindset of hey, I want a strong program that is going to have high status, right, and win games. So I think there's like and again, that this could vary, right? This varies across sports in different schools. But yeah, I think I would prefer like a structural policy fund where like, no, we're going to fund like an intramural, interscholastic, but kind of intramural based kind of sports participatory program, which is going to be tied to this. But yeah, I'd love to talk more.
As
more
all,
about the
as your
number.
school board director here in Seattle, I just have to say how much I appreciate that suggestion. And you're reminding me that when I lived in Italy as a junior, I was an exchange student. I was the beneficiary of a position like that they had, who was a PE teacher who spent her time trying to get girls into sports in an intramural basis. And that's how I ended up running cross country. I'm a horrible cross country runner, but it has become my source of mental health and physical health for all of my life. That one person in sports in my high school in Italy, even though it's not my favorite thing and I'm terrible at it, but it's a source of, and that's what I so appreciate about your answer and why I think all of this is so important. So thank you.
Thank you.
Let's solicit some suggestions, ideas from everybody here. What could we be doing, either as an organization like RARE or as individuals, to address some of the things that Dr. Manning's talked about? I think we're just talking about better funding for coaches, but not just better funding, but funding a different model of a coach, maybe at not just high school level, but lower down. Who's got some other suggestions, some ideas that pop up? Okay, come on, everybody. How about Joe Hunter? You got any ideas, Joe, that we should be looking at?
Well, the thing that I'm thinking of, and I'm thinking of connections, and what Tim is working on there in terms of creating activities for students that maybe live in a less diverse community, to interact with students that live in maybe a more diverse community, and creating activities for them to get to know each other as individuals. And I've played sports all my life. It's a large part of who I am as a person. And a lot of the relationships that I have are tied with sports in some way. Even in the business, the field of business, you can take a lot of the things that you learn in playing sports, whether it's competitiveness or working as a team or whatever it is, and you can tie it to things that you learn when you're playing sports and so forth. But I guess the question I have for you, Dr. Manning, is in understanding what we're trying to do with connections, and creating these type of activities. How would you see it working in the area of sports, youth sports?
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about RARE, something about a high school, I think about how can you use like the facilities of Roosevelt, right, to kind of host, and then like you saying, like, so could Roosevelt be like a meeting point, right? And or you could partner with other high schools and like maybe you like create a relationship with a different high school in a different district or whatever, different neighborhood, and to create that space. And so what I would say, and when I say create that space, the other part of this too, I'll emphasize is that I think the other part is to get youth actually organizing the space. I think sometimes a lot of what we think about youth sports is like adults making decisions, right? And then kids are kind of following along. I think it's actually, even when people talk about why they love sports, it's not because the adults dictated things, right? The adults kind of created an environment, maybe, or maybe for some of y'all, it was more like free play, right? You kind of went and played with people and then that kind of organically happened. I think for RARE, when I was thinking about this, when y'all is about how can you work with current students who might be interested in this, right? To kind of host something like, can we create an event or series, right, where we have these like a sports gathering interaction and like supplement it with different things, right, around anti-racism, right? I don't know, like that, but I think about something like that is possible. But but yeah, I think about like how can you kind of like create these spaces where people can gather on, not just like a one-off, right? The other part would be it couldn't be just like a one-off thing, right? It would need to be kind of a regular thing where youth people like, oh, this is a space I can go to, right? So that's one idea.
That's a nice idea, and I think the part about the youth leading it and taking the initiative themselves, and us trying to provide the forum, but not the direction. And I grew up like Joe. I grew up playing competitive sports, and I loved to compete, and I loved to win. And I think that in this kind of program that Joe was just describing, this connections, when we get involved in sports, we've got to think of ways to not replicate that. It's not going to be Rainier Beach against Roosevelt at Roosevelt or at Rainier Beach. It's going to be either a sport that is more easily sort of shared success, helping each other succeed, or even a sport like whatever, traditional, basketball or baseball, where you can mix the teams and mix the outcomes and not focus on, who beat whom. And I hate to say that because I used to love to, win, but I think we got to think of ways to introduce that element of cooperation, collaboration.
See, Gerald has his hand up.
Go ahead, Joe.
Good evening. I was thinking along the lines you were talking about. I work at Lesser Elementary. And I was thinking of when the sports and the parents gathered what kind of sport they want their youth to be in. There should be a youth panel too, so they can say some of the things they expect of the parents and some of the things they expect of the referees and the coaches. I think they should have a more say in how they want this to roll out versus how the adults always say what they want, right? So I think like a sports youth equity team, they can get together with other students of the races to say, this is what we don't want in our sport. And we demand this from our parents, or maybe we just don't play.
Thank you, Gerald. We've got a couple of other comments that have come through the chat. Jane, thank you for your comment. It says, what about kids who are forced into sports because they're expected to be good? And she said that her personal experience was that people always asked her if she ran track. She said, I ran one meet in junior high school and I hated it. And it was, and she said she was bad at it. So what, you have any thoughts on that?
So I want to be clear, right? Like, I don't think sports is the be all end all, right? And we should definitely, like, I think in general, and this is one of the communities I spent a lot of time with, their whole thing, it was about soccer. Their whole thing was to make sure kids did not feel burnt out and did not feel forced, right? I actually thought they were pretty successful, right? Actually, the kids that I spent the most time with, they had joy for the game because I think we kind of removed a lot of this like being forced. There was no forcing, right? Like that's angle. So I don't think there should ever be like forcing people into competitive sport. But that's the other. I think that is then a flaw of how sports are being organized, right? I think even if you hated track, and generally my interaction is anecdotal, but generally I found lots of people who have found other types of physical outlets that are very enjoyable. That basically because they're like the antithesis of right the problematic aspects of youth sport. But I would add, right, the concern I have though is take sport. I know we're on sport here, but I'm actually also concerned about other youth extracurricular activities, kind of following a similar model of kind of hyper competition, resource status, kind of hoarding. You can see it's like there's like the tournament. The word is the sportization of the turnification. I'm not butcher that. Basically, making tournaments out of everything, or activities that you don't need tournaments for, right? Like spelling bee, math Olympiad, like all these things that basically kind of create this similar model. It has nothing to do with sports, right? Like I don't. So that's other kind of that question or comment made me think about that. So no, we should not be forcing kids into sport. Like, I think that's what we're kind of getting at here, like kind of like a more participatory model. I think would actually help with that. Like if a kid can hop in on the youth, like Gerald's like the youth kind of panel, like, oh, we want to do this sport for a bit, and that's cool. Then I can leave and it's fine. But like I actually have access to do it, right? Now I feel like if you want to actually do it, you got to kind of go for it, right? And that's where it kind of leads to the potential burnout.
Tony, did you want to further the discussion about next steps in RARE, or how did you get enough feedback? Because there is something here in the chat that there's a sports in school that tries to work on some of these issues that we've discussed, and we might make contact with them.
Yeah, thanks for that, Maggie. Do you, Alex, or does anyone know what that sport, any comment on sports in school? I'm not familiar.
I have not heard. Sounds good.
Well, yeah, we'll look into it. One thing that's on my mind, it was in the pre-reads, actually it was in that video that Brian Gumboldt, I think, was leading making the points that you made about, actually they said that the participation in sports has gone down significantly in schools, along with the creation of these select teams and the cost. And of course, the ones who it's gone down for are mostly those who can't afford it. And it seems like that is a development that's taken place since I was in high school anyway. There was nothing like that. So it's been built up over the decades, over the years. How do we start to unravel it? I mean, the other piece that was mentioned is funding for, government funding, city funding for good facilities, gyms, places where kids can play. That's gone down. So that's driven it too. And it's this kind of, what do you call it? A polarization in our society, like so many things, right? The rich get more and the ones without get less access. So how do we start to unravel that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you completely. I think that's why I emphasize, like, so what places kind of have some of these subsidies built in, right? So it's actually, sorry, the one I would push is not just facilities. I actually think we have okay facilities. It is, do we have the folks who create environments of sport, like healthy sport, right? So I'm going kind of back to coaching, but not even that, but like funding for programming. I think we have a kind of program issue, right? Can Rare be involved in like supporting programming that does what we kind of think sports should be? And I would say, is youth sport a public good, right? Or, and that's what you got, this kind of, it's gotta become more private, more and more privatized. And at the school, right? So like, can kids actually participate in this within schools, kind of subsidized in that way, within community centers? Like, I think the other part is community centers, right? The funding, that's the city angle, is right. In my experience, the community centers, you have underfunding, so you have people kind of just like managing the facility, but not creating programming, trying to invite people in, right? It's kind of like we're just hoping people go to Garfield Community Center and play, right? But there's not actually much going on there to be like, hey, this is really cool, right? Come down, come down here. So that's the other angle, and that was like, how can you actually create programming that's inviting, accessible, etc. And programming doesn't mean like it has to be like, I'm going to coach elite skills. It literally could just be like, hey, we're organizing games or we're organizing play. Yeah.
Okay, great. We're getting toward the end of the time here, just about 7 minutes left. Maybe we'll take one more question from John and then try to summarize, and maybe Joe, if you've got something to say here at the end as well. But John, go ahead with your suggestion or question.
I think John never took his hand down.
Oh, okay, John's.
Oh, yeah. Hey, sorry about that.
Okay,
A Zoom error on my part. No more questions.
Gunners has his hand up.
Yeah.
It's been interesting listening to this whole thing. I grew up, again, just like most of you did, in the public school environment, whatever. And once my kids came along, we ended up being involved in the CYO sports. And we've done elite soccer, we've done elite baseball, we've done all kinds of different sports, whether there be participatory or whatever. But I think a couple of things, it's like Alex said, I think it's a real complicated question. And I think you have to start at a very young level. The problem is when your kids are first starting out, you're looking for coaches. I mean, you're looking for coaches that are going to volunteer. And these coaches aren't people that are experienced. They're not, they don't know what they're doing. I had to go to several clinics just because of the worry that I had that I might ruin somebody's career going forward or whatever. And I wanted to teach them to play basketball the right way and whatever. I think there's some kind of there needs to be some training that's involved that involves both the coaches and the parents. And it's the thing that's really difficult is finding coaches that are strong, I think, in their personalities. Because I know several times during the time that I coached basketball, we ran into some racial issues. And we kicked out people from the gym for the year, said, hey, we don't want to see you back in here. You're out of here. This isn't the attitude we want to participate to the kids that are around us. I was a soccer commissioner for a while for our school and stuff. And I said, hey, I opened it up to the parents and the students, whatever. I said, call me directly. I will work the issue. Don't call the coach. Don't complain to them. Let them focus on coaching the basketball or the soccer, or whatever it was. One of the things that I kind of heard here that I thought would be kind of interesting, and we saw work before, is possibly getting some of the, maybe the high school level kids involved in encouraging them to do some coaching and stuff at a younger level and give them some parent oversight. Maybe you have a parent that's strong, says, hey, I can take on 2 or 3 of these coaches and, guide them, and let them, if they have issues, or sit on the bench with them while they're coaching, but let them make all the decisions. Because kind of like what I said on the side here about Griffey being assigned by the MLB, young kids don't know who Griffey is. He was great for us or whatever like that, but they're looking for young heroes. And if they can see, kids that are like maybe in high school, if they knew they grew up, that they're doing well and they're coming here back to help them. I think things like that, emphasis like that, could be really important for helping out at youth levels. I'm done.
No, I'll just quickly add, the idea of young people being like the coaches for other young people is I very much agree with. And I think there's a lot of potential there. I just want to echo that.
Yeah. Dr. Manning, I was just wondering now, and again, when I was a kid 50 years ago, it's been a while, but we used to play outside all the time and, at the park all the time. And I'm just wondering, now there's so many options for youth, with the social media, the video games, and all these other things, that I'm just wondering that, unless a kid is an elite athlete or very good at a particular sport, do they choose, because of all these other options available that I just mentioned, do they choose not to participate? And I don't know if there's any data or anything that shows, okay, 10 years ago, we had X percentage of youth involved in sports versus, today. But visually, as I look outside, I don't see that many kids playing. I mean, just everyday playing soccer, football, baseball, whatever it is.
So yeah, Joe, you're getting at the idea, like there's really less kind of free, less, what people call it free play, other calls it unstructured play, right? And this, I think I see Robert Heller's question too, like about not just sports, but just like outdoor physical activity. And yes, there's some data on that. Just with sports, we definitely see less multi-sport participation, and we definitely see people drop out earlier. So the kids will put, like, the numbers are decent and people drop out earlier, kind of getting what you're talking about. And that's back to, right, what are the outlets? I think right now we have a really problem. Basically, like, you can kind of participate and like up to age 12, and I could include this just talking about like team sports or like competitive sport. But then like we make most of how we organize youth sport is that you're gonna, if you can't make it to that certain level, which I'm just saying is like a travel team or a high school participatory level, there's not many community rec leagues for like teenagers. So I think that's what you're getting at. But to me, that's all part of it. Like, there's no kind of outlet to play, and there's no programming to like create these spaces. Then of course kids will do social media, and like that's not necessarily, they'll do other stuff, right? People will entertain them, kids will figure out things to do. So to me, it's like, again, about these kind of other things kind of tied to it, right? It's not just like, oh, social media is taking kids away. I would actually argue we've structurally taken away opportunities, right, for kids to kind of explore these different levels of sports or physical activity. And yeah, I saw it in the chat from Robert Hill. I would say, yes, sports includes physical activity that's not involved with teams. But again, like for running, right? Like, do we have those opportunities for kids, or is that just a kid deciding, we're just hoping an individual kid likes to run? Weightlifting, like a kid's lift weights, but again, that seems like that's very much like you kind of just find your own way. There's not necessarily like support for that type of stuff, right? So the Gunner says rec centers need coaches. That again, that's why like it's intertwined, right? we need like to actually, if we think of it as a public good, we need more coaches to like create these environments. We need more programming, or we need more funding, et cetera, to create all the different options. I think you'd have kids be like, oh, I could do this, maybe a little less social media if they want, or they can do both, right? But not just one or the other.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I think we need to, we try to stay on time here, and Dr. Manning, Alex has given us 90 minutes of just great information and a lot of good questions. I see there's a few other suggestions in the chat that we're going to follow up on from Tashika and also from Michael. So great, thanks for all that, everybody, and especially to Dr. Manning. I mean, busy life as a professor. I know he was in the Northwest recently, which is good to hear, but in his old stomping grounds. Anyway, best of luck going forward, Alex, and we'll hope to see you again, maybe at a future session, and maybe in touch with you about follow up a couple of these questions. But everybody, thanks a lot. Let's give them a verbal hand. And Jody, do you want to, or Nadja, any last comments?
No, I think you said it well. Thank you, Dr. Manning. Thank you very much. It's good information. Yes.
Thanks so much. Enjoyed it. Great conversation. If you had a question in the chat and I didn't get to answer, I can hang out for a couple minutes if you really want to talk.
I just want to remind everyone, Nadja mentioned it at the very beginning about the survey. If you could go to that link and complete the survey, we really would appreciate it. We need your feedback.
That's great. She just put it in the chat again, so it's real easy to find. So yeah, please be good to get 100% participation in the survey. All right, everybody. Alex offered to hang around for a minute, but otherwise everyone's free to sign off, and we'll see you next time. Our next session is September 13th, and it's about Nadja, maybe you could just say a word about that real quick.
It's a Technology Access Foundation. They have the STEM program that is currently in 2 Seattle public schools. They got a bite from their program and their efforts to train educators to be able to present and teach the STEM program. And so they're in Federal Way. They have an academy in Federal Way. So the Federal Way School District has really bought on and embraced what they're doing. So there'll be 4 representatives from TAF that will present on the 13th of September. So join us. Chime in and join us again.
Great. Thanks again.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Great.